Hey guys! Tonight, we begin with a story soaked in incense smoke, maize, and an unsettling amount of human organs. So grab your tea, snuggle in, and let's drift into the gently thumping heart of the Aztec world. A place where the gods didn't just appreciate a good sacrifice, they demanded it, religiously, literally. Now I know what you're thinking. Human sacrifice for bedtime? Yes, on paper, this might not scream cozy relaxation, but trust me, we're not doing high drama or gory details, just calmly floating through one of history's most organized blood donation systems, one priest at a time. So, let's start at the top, the gods, specifically the ones who needed help staying alive. In Aztec mythology, the divine were not self-sufficient. They were exhausting, frankly, needy, temperamental, like overgrown toddlers with planetary influence. And none were needier than Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec god of the sun and war, a divine overachiever. He was born fully grown, armed to the teeth, and immediately decapitated his sister for trying to murder their mother. We've all had messy family dynamics, but this one was especially intense. Huitzilopochtli then threw his sister's head into the sky, and there she became the moon. Symbolism, drama, blood spatter. Pretty much the Aztec aesthetic in a nutshell. Now, from this cheery mythos came the core belief the universe required blood to stay balanced. The sun needed strength. The gods needed fuel. If no one sacrificed anything, the world could fall apart. And by anything, they meant hearts, skin, limbs, and the occasional full-body volunteer. The Aztecs were nothing if not thorough. This wasn't a spontaneous affair. It was highly structured, deeply ceremonial, and involved more planning than most modern weddings. At the center of it all was Tenochtitlan, the grand capital city built on a lake, glittering with temples and temples stacked on top of temples. At the heart of the city stood the Templo Mayor, a giant pyramid complex devoted to Huitzilopochtli and his rain god bestie Tlaloc. These two ran the empire's religious life like underworld project managers. One needed blood to move the sun, the other needed tears to bring the rain. Together, they made a spectacularly dramatic tag team.
Let's float into how it worked. Sacrifice wasn't one size fits all. There were, in fact, many methods, each custom fit for the divine recipient. Heart extraction was the big crowd pleaser, the classic, a sort of Aztec signature move. The victim, often a captured warrior or specially chosen figure, would be painted, adorned with feathers, guided up the long, slightly too steep temple stairs, and laid across a stone altar. The priest would then use an obsidian blade to slice under the rib cage, reach in, and remove the still beating heart. It was theatrical, efficient, messy, and entirely expected. Then there was decapitation, which was particularly popular for fertility gods. Heads would be lopped off and sometimes displayed on a tzampantli, or skull rack. Picture an industrial-sized coat rack for skulls, placed conveniently near the temple courtyard, presumably for both intimidation and interior design purposes. For the god Xipe Totec, flaying was the preferred method. Yes, flaying, skinning. Because what better way to honor the god of renewal and agriculture than to remove someone's epidermis and wear it like a human wetsuit? Priests would literally drape themselves in freshly removed skin, walking slowly and ceremonially through the city. It was supposed to symbolize rebirth, but really just gave off I forgot to pack clothes and had to improvise energy. Then we have drowning, which was Tlaloc's thing. He liked the drama of it, particularly when the victims were children, whose tears were believed to bring rain. And I know, yes, it's a lot. But from the Aztec point of view, those children were messengers, sacred, necessary, and mourned in ceremony. Then there was arrow sacrifice, where the victim would be tied and slowly filled with arrows until blood poured out in nice, rhythmic streams. A bit less efficient, but very on brand for gods who liked aesthetics with their offerings.
If you were chosen for sacrifice, congratulations. You were about to be deeply respected, elaborately decorated, and killed in front of hundreds. A true, full-service experience. The Aztecs took ceremony very seriously. The victims were painted, given symbolic items to hold, and walked through the steps like a very somber graduation. Only instead of a diploma, you got eternal transformation and a front row seat to the afterlife. And then there were the volunteers. Yes, some people actually volunteered. Particularly in the Toxcatl festival, when one especially handsome young man would be selected to live for a year as the god Tezcatlipoca. He got to wear divine outfits, play the flute, have ceremonial wives, and live like a rock star. Until, of course, he was walked up the temple and sacrificed in peak dramatic fashion. No refunds. And before you ask, yes, they believed this was an honor. A deeply spiritual, sacred transition. The man who played Tezcatlipoca wasn't tricked or drugged. He knew the role, he knew the outcome, and he still did it. Because to be part of the divine machinery was the greatest thing you could do. So as we drift across the temple steps and waft past the incense smoke, let's keep gliding toward the real power behind the rituals. The emperors, the politicians, the ones who turned sacrifice into state policy, the ones who believed they were extensions of the gods themselves. We'll meet them next. Let's keep floating. Now that we've met the gods and their very specific dietary needs, let's meander into the marble-floored, feather-decorated halls of power, the Aztec emperors. The real masterminds behind this deeply spiritual, yet oddly administrative operation. And yes, they were very into it. Imagine if your head of state also ran the National Theater and oversaw a never-ending live-action mythological performance, with a lot of knives. The title was Huitzilopochtli, which roughly means great speaker. Though great executor of elaborate sacrificial bureaucracy might have been more accurate. The Aztec ruler wasn't just a king, he was a priest king, a walking holy mandate, half man, half PR campaign for the sun god. And when things went wrong, drought, famine, inconvenient celestial alignments, it was the emperor's responsibility to fix it. Not with policy, with blood. Our first major emperor of note was Huitzilopochtli, which means obsidian serpent, because apparently everyone in the 15th century was naming their kids like Mortal Kombat characters. Huitzilopochtli was the one who really kicked the empire into high gear. Under him, the Aztecs began their legendary expansion, not just to conquer land, but to ensure a steady supply of tribute and captives. Can't have a good rain festival without enough hearts to go around. Huitzilopochtli also did something very on brand for a theocratic empire. He burned the old books, the pre-Aztec histories, gone. Instead, he commissioned new ones, more flattering ones where the Aztecs were basically chosen by destiny and descended from divine snakes or something equally dramatic. It was a full historical rebranding. Think of it like state-sponsored mythologizing, but with a lot more jaguar skins and ceremonial drums. Then came Moctezuma I, not to be confused with Moctezuma II, who we'll get to, and who was, let's say, less lucky. Moctezuma I expanded both the empire and the religious apparatus.
He was the one who really got into the logistics of sacrifice. Bigger temples, more rituals, a national schedule. Under his rule, Tenochtitlan turned into a city of permanent pageantry. The sun rose on processions, sacrifices, dances, prayers, more sacrifices. The man was basically an event planner with a knife collection. And he wasn't subtle about it. After a major military victory, Moctezuma I allegedly ordered the sacrifice of over 20,000 prisoners, possibly 40,000. Who's counting? Well, probably a lot of priests with sore arms. It's hard to say how accurate those numbers are. Ancient chroniclers were not known for their restraint. But the message was clear. Empire, power, divine favor, all reinforced through ritualized, very public violence. And then we arrive at Huitzilopochtli, whose name literally means water monster, and whose reign was arguably peak Aztec in both expansion and sacrifice. He completed the biggest version of the Templo Mayor, and to inaugurate it, naturally, he threw a little party, just a small one, with about 80,000 people sacrificed over 4 days. Which seems ambitious. Again, numbers vary. Some modern historians suggest it may have been closer to 10,000 or even 4,000. But either way, imagine the planning involved. Rotating priests, backup obsidian blades, probably an entire catering team just for the performers. It was, in a word, excessive, but excess was the point.
Huitzilopochtli also made it rain, literally. After a particularly dramatic dry spell, he had an entire ceremony with child sacrifices to Tlaloc. The children were required to cry during the ceremony. It was considered a good omen. If they didn't cry naturally, there were ways to encourage it. And yes, that's exactly as emotionally bleak as it sounds. But again, in Aztec terms, this wasn't cruelty. It was salvation, a necessary payment, a tragic but noble role in the sacred economy. And then came the emperor whose name everyone remembers, mostly for how it all fell apart. Moctezuma II, the melancholy monarch, the anxious philosopher king, the one who ruled during that incredibly inconvenient moment when the Spanish showed up with horses, guns, and absolutely no chill. Moctezuma II took his job very seriously, maybe too seriously. He wasn't just ruler, he styled himself as the high priest of the entire empire. He became increasingly withdrawn, spiritually obsessed, and, depending on your sources, possibly convinced that his rule was tied to cosmic destiny. He interpreted omens, earthquakes, eclipses, strange birds. He brooded over them like a 15th century Hamlet. Every cloud was a message, every burning temple a divine critique. So when word came that pale-skinned, bearded strangers had landed on the coast with metal armor and barking animals, Moctezuma did what any sun-addled, spiritually exhausted emperor might do. He wondered if they were gods. Specifically, if Hernán Cortés was the returning god Quetzalcoatl, because why not double down on the paranoia? He sent gifts. He tried diplomacy. He hoped appeasement would work. Spoiler, it did not. Within 2 years, Cortés was marching through Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma was taken hostage, and the grand machinery of sacrifice and sun maintenance began to sputter. We'll come back to the whole Spanish conquest and collapse thing later. Right now, let's keep the vibe sleepy and focus on how for centuries the emperors of the Aztec world used ritual as performance. Sacrifice wasn't just religious, it was theatrical, political, psychological, a stage on which the state could act out its divinely mandated superiority, and everyone, from the emperor in his feathered cloak to the captive in body paint, had a role to play. But even the best systems need upkeep, and the Aztecs, ever the overachievers, had a full religious class to handle that. Let's float now to the priests, the real backstage crew of this blood-soaked empire, the ones with the calendars, the knives, the matching outfits, because someone had to make sure all that sacrifice ran on time. And yes, there were uniforms. But we'll get to those next. Now that we've floated through the Emperor's obsession with keeping the gods happy and the sun on schedule, let's slow our steps and glide into the temple itself. Not the shiny outer steps where the crowds gathered and hearts hit the floor. No, we're going behind the curtain, into the shadows, into the domain of the Aztec priesthood, the real MVPs of cosmic continuity, the ones who never had a day off because the gods apparently had no concept of work-life balance. The priesthood in Aztec society was not a casual calling. You didn't just wander into it after a midlife crisis. It started early, often in childhood. Boys were chosen or dedicated to the gods by their families, and once that path was set, you were in for a life of celibacy, ritual bathing, fasting, and daily ceremonies. Oh, and cutting things. Lots of cutting. There were different ranks and specialties, of course. You had the Plenamakak, or fire priests, who handled the burning stuff, the Tlaloc, who worked closely with the military and oversaw the capture of war prisoners. And at the top of the very bloody pyramid were the high priests, particularly the Huitzilopochtli Totec Tlaloc, whose name you do not have to remember. Just know he was the top-tiered divine manager, like a bishop, but with more bloodstains. Priests wore black robes, often decorated with bones or flayed skins, depending on their duties and the deity they served. They also wore their hair long, often matted with dried blood, which sounds unpleasant, but was considered a sign of religious devotion. Imagine dreadlocks, but held together with ceremonial goo and divine anxiety. Grooming was optional, apparently. You didn't want a fashionable priest, you wanted a terrifying one. One of the key rituals for priests was auto-sacrifice. That's right, they didn't just sacrifice others, they participated too, daily, usually by drawing blood from their ears, tongues, or even genitals, because apparently that was the holy trifecta. A little prick to the tongue in the morning to keep the sun from collapsing? That's just a Tuesday. And they'd collect that blood on paper, burn it, and send it skyward as a gift. A nice offering, like a Valentine's Day card for the gods, only soggier.
And they did it all while running the calendar. Yes, priests were the timekeepers. The Aztec religious calendar was, brace yourself, a 260-day cycle called the Tonalpoali, intertwined with a 365-day solar calendar, the Xipe. These worked together like interlocking gears, or like two Excel spreadsheets constantly yelling at each other. It was precise, complicated, and entirely the priest's responsibility. They used these cycles to determine the timing of festivals, sacrifices, corn planting, haircut days, and presumably everything else you could tie to destiny. If a certain day was unlucky, no one dared hold a ceremony. If it was especially sacred, well, better make sure you've got enough captives lined up. And don't forget to bathe in cold water first. Which reminds me, bathing. A lot of it. Priests were expected to purify themselves regularly, usually in the icy waters of Lake Texcoco, at dawn, while fasting, before sacrificing anything. So if they seemed cranky, that might be why. Try being a morning person when your pre-breakfast routine involves lake water and ritual bleeding. They also fasted frequently, sometimes for days or weeks, because physical suffering brought spiritual clarity, or maybe just mild hallucinations. Either way, it was all in service of the gods. And of course, they weren't allowed to marry or engage in, let's say, recreational activities. Celibacy was non-negotiable, which may explain why they were so enthusiastic about stabbing things. That energy had to go somewhere. Now, when the time came for a big public sacrifice, the priestly team got into full production mode. Picture a backstage crew in a Broadway play, except with obsidian knives and feathers.
The main sacrifice team usually had 4 assistant priests, each holding down a limb of the victim, and 1 lead priest who performed the actual heart extraction. The speed and precision of this process was apparently impressive. Horrifying, yes, but technically impressive. The extracted heart would be raised to the sky, offered to the sun god, then placed in a sacred bowl. The body might be rolled down the temple steps, to the delight or horror of onlookers, or carried away for ritual dismemberment. In some cases, the skull would join the tzompantli. In others, bones might be cleaned and stored, always with ceremony, always with purpose. And the thing is, this was all normal, expected, sacred. People brought flowers, danced, sang. Sacrifice was the heartbeat of Aztec public life, and the priests were the ones who kept it all flowing. Like cosmic accountants, but with way more bloodletting and significantly worse office lighting. They weren't just religious figures. They were astronomers, philosophers, historians, interpreters of dreams, decoders of omens, and occasionally therapists, though their version of therapy involved less talking and more cauterized wounds. They advised emperors, oversaw festivals, and decided what day was best to sacrifice your enemies. That's influence. And it wasn't all gloom. There were joyful rituals, flower offerings, music, feasting. Not everything was death and drama. But when the calendar said Big Sacrifice Day, the priests made sure everything ran on time. The temple was cleaned, the captives were painted, the blades were polished, the gods were watching. And you did not want to disappoint a god who already had your son hostage. As the empire grew, the ceremonies became grander, more elaborate, more theatrical. The priests had to manage larger crowds, more prisoners, and increasingly complicated divine expectations. It was a full-time job with overtime and no holidays. Just ceremonial fire, obsidian knives, and the constant nagging thought that if you didn't do this properly, the sun might stop rising. But nothing lasts forever. Even the most meticulous priesthood can't hold back the tide of conquistadors and smallpox. And as the 16th century crept in, so did the beginning of the end. In Part 4, we'll gently drift toward the empire's collapse, the final sacrifices, the last desperate omens, and a slow, strange transformation of Tenochtitlan from temple capital to colonial city. But for now, let's stay a little longer in the flickering torchlight, among the chanting priests and the scent of copal. The gods are fed, the calendar turns, and everything, for now, is balanced. It was the early 16th century, and the Aztec Empire, technically the Triple Alliance, but let's not get too administrative about it, was doing great, monumentally great. Expanding, sacrificing, building pyramids like there was no tomorrow. Which, well, we'll get to that. The people paid their tribute, the priests read their calendars, the gods got their organs. Business as usual. Except there were signs. Little ones, ominous ones. You know the vibe. Sudden comets, eclipses. A fire temple that burned without warning, a heron with a mirror on its head. Don't ask. The point is, it was all very unsettling. And the priests? Oh, they noticed.
And then came the ships. Floating mountains, they were called, by the locals who saw them first. Enormous and alien and full of shiny, loud people who didn't speak Nahuatl and didn't seem to have any chill whatsoever. Horses, steel, gunpowder, beards, none of it was on the usual celestial script. The sun didn't say anything about this, neither did the calendar. Hernan Cortez arrived on the coast of what is now Veracruz in 1519 with a few hundred men, a lot of ambition, and a deep misunderstanding of literally everything he was about to walk into. The Spaniards had heard tales of gold, temples, strange rituals, and a wealthy inland empire. They didn't yet know the details, just that something big was waiting, something sacred, something worth conquering. Probably. They were winging it. Now, Moctezuma II, our anxious calendar-watching emperor from Part 2, had a problem. Actually, several. First, the omens. Second, the uninvited guests who may or may not be divine. Third, the growing sense that something about all this felt like the beginning of a historical turning point. To his credit, Moctezuma tried. He sent gifts, gold, clothes, feathers, nice things. Not a good move, in retrospect. It only confirmed to Cortez that there was indeed gold, and therefore more gold, and possibly even some gold on top of that. Cortez, already a professional opportunist, was very encouraged. This was not going to be a diplomatic visit. The Aztec Empire at this point wasn't universally loved. Many surrounding city-states had been under constant pressure, military, economic, and sacrificial. Remember those flower wars? Yeah, not everyone enjoyed being the empire's ritual pantry. So when Cortez started moving inland, a lot of locals were surprisingly willing to help, especially the Tlaxcalans, who were like, "Oh, you want to fight the Aztecs? Cool. Been waiting for someone with cannons." It all escalated faster than a bad group project. Cortez and his new allies marched into the Valley of Mexico. Along the way, he got his hands on a translator/consort named Malintzin, also known as La Malinche, who helped bridge the gaping cultural void between the Spanish and the Nahua peoples. Through her, he got information, allies, and the illusion of diplomacy. And then, at long last, he arrived at the gates of Tenochtitlan. Now, this city was a masterpiece. Built on a lake, canals, causeways, towering temples, a shimmering island metropolis, more advanced than anything the Spaniards had ever seen. But did they react with wonder and respect? Not really. More like greed, confusion, and vague colonial smirking. Moctezuma greeted them personally, welcomed them into the city, gave them gifts, put them up in a palace. Because sure, why not? Let the heavily armed strangers wander around the sacred capital while trying to figure out if one of them is the god Quetzalcoatl, returning from exile. That always works out. It didn't. Tensions rose. The Spaniards, shocked by the sacrificial altars and the whole bleeding heart on a pedestal aesthetic, decided the Aztecs needed saving from themselves, which was a bold stance from men who still thought bathing was optional. But more importantly, they wanted control. Eventually, Cortez kidnapped Moctezuma. Yes, kidnapped. Just politely kept him as a guest in his own palace under armed guard. The emperor became a puppet. The city held its breath. And somewhere, the sun probably considered taking a personal day. Then, Cortez had to briefly leave the city to deal with some bureaucratic mutiny nonsense from another Spanish commander. In his absence, his lieutenant, Pedro Alvarado, made a decision. A bad one. During the Tuxcot festival, remember that one, with the sacrificial flute guy? Alvarado panicked. Or maybe he was just being preemptively violent. Either way, he ordered a massacre. Hundreds of Aztec nobles, unarmed and dancing, were slaughtered in the sacred precinct, mid-ceremony. It was not well received. The city erupted. The streets turned hostile. Barricades went up. Moctezuma, now despised by his people for not standing up to the invaders, tried to calm the crowds from a balcony. According to Spanish sources, he was hit in the head by a rock thrown by his own people. Other accounts say the Spaniards killed him. Either way, he died. The Emperor of the Sun, silenced. The Spanish tried to flee, and on the night of June 30th, 1920, during a storm, they attempted a secret escape across the causeways. It did not go well. The Aztecs attacked. Dozens of Spaniards drowned, weighed down by the gold they tried to steal. Cortés survived, barely, and the event became known as La Noche Triste, the Sad Night, which, if anything, undersells it. But the story wasn't over. Cortés regrouped, returned with more troops, more weapons, more native allies. A siege began, a slow, brutal one. Tenochtitlan, cut off and starving, began to collapse. Disease, brought by the Europeans, tore through the population. Smallpox did what obsidian knives could not. Entire families wiped out. Priests died. Rituals stopped. The gods were no longer being fed. The sun, it seemed, would fade.
By August 1521, the city fell. The temples were torn down, the Tzompantli dismantled, the Templo Mayor destroyed. In its place, churches, crosses, the beginning of colonial Mexico. The world tilted. The gods grew silent. The empire of blood and balance became a chapter in someone else's book. But the memory lingered in stories, in ruins, in codices hidden and half-burned, in the names of gods whispered on street corners and remembered in the corners of old libraries. The sacrifices, for all their violence, had meaning, structure. They were not madness, they were devotion, a belief that the world must be fed to keep turning. And now, as the night grows deeper and the candles flicker lower, we leave Tenochtitlan behind. Quiet now, still. The drums have stopped. The pyramids sleep beneath the earth. But for a while, just a few centuries, the gods were fed, the sun rose, and the world kept turning, because a people believed it must.
Before we wander into the dust and glow of the Nile, let's pause for a moment. Tonight's journey is a story of food, but also of survival, ritual, and ambition. It stretches from the humblest mud brick kitchens to the dazzling feasts of kings. This is feasting in ancient Egypt, from farmer's bowl to pharaoh's banquet. Let's start at the bottom, the actual bottom. Imagine yourself as a humble Egyptian farmer in 2500 BCE. You wake up in your mud brick house, which is, generously speaking, about 1.5 rooms. There's no bed, no plumbing, and the roof is made of straw you're constantly patching. The Nile's just over there, calmly existing like it owns the place, which, to be fair, it kind of does. Because without the Nile, Egypt is just sand and heat exhaustion. So, you stretch your aching limbs because yes, you've been sleeping on woven mats again, and it's time to eat. Breakfast, such as it is, usually involved beer. That's right, ancient Egyptian beer wasn't the hoppy craft stuff you sip at hipster bars. It was thick, soupy, and probably tasted like if someone left oatmeal out in the sun for 2 days. But it was full of calories and surprisingly nutritious, and given how hot it was, you weren't exactly craving a hot cup of tea. Alongside your breakfast beer, you had bread. Not the fluffy kind. We're talking dense, flat, half-burned loaves baked in a clay oven that may or may not be smoking up your living area. The flour was usually full of sand because grinding it on a stone slab meant the grains picked up, well, grit, which is probably why ancient Egyptians had dental records that read like a dentist's horror story. The number of abscesses found in mummies is genuinely upsetting. But you weren't thinking about that. You were dipping your gritty bread into some mashed beans or lentils and getting on with your day. Now, most commoners didn't eat meat, not because they were vegetarians, but because animals were expensive and you were,
frankly, not. If you were lucky, you might have caught a fish or bought some salted perch from the market. If you were really lucky, like birthday level lucky, you might get a scrap of goat or a dried piece of goose. Otherwise, your protein came from beans, pulses, and whatever bugs landed on your lentils when you weren't looking. But here's the thing. For all the hardship, Egyptian farmers ate relatively well. Their diet was varied. They had garlic, onions, leeks, cucumbers, figs, and dates. They had honey. They had coriander and dill and cumin. It wasn't gourmet, but it was deeply functional, reliable, comforting in its own slightly chewy way.
And then there was beer. Again, with pretty much every meal. Children drank it, the elderly drank it, even the temple priests drank it. Though, to be fair, the temple priests were probably also drinking wine out of golden cups, but we'll get to them. The Nile, of course, made everything possible. It flooded regularly, dumped rich silt onto the farmlands, and then receded politely so crops could be planted. Wheat and barley were the main staples. You'd harvest them, grind them, and spend several hours coughing because no one had invented grain filters. And after all that, you'd get another round of sandy flour. Delicious. Now let's gently rise up the social ladder. Float past the mud brick houses, past the reed huts, and into the homes of artisans and scribes. These were the folks who worked for temples, the state, or very demanding pharaohs who wanted their tombs to look like a Netflix documentary in stone. These middle-class-ish Egyptians had slightly better food, more seasoning, less sand in their bread, slightly more fish, still lots of beer, but also a bit of wine, imported if you were fancy, maybe even a date cake on religious holidays. Nothing wild, just a soft splurge. They also had access to food through temple rations. Being connected to the temple economy was a serious leg up. You got meat from sacrifices, bread from temple bakeries, and oil, which was otherwise expensive and hoarded like it was ancient Egyptian Bitcoin. Scribes especially lived well. Literacy was rare, so if you could write and read, even just enough to do taxes, you were basically a national treasure. Pharaohs wanted you, priests wanted you, and scribes used that leverage to avoid farming, which is honestly the smartest move of all. But now, let's float a little higher, past the craftsmen, past the tax collectors, into the thick-walled mansions of the elite. These were the officials, the generals, the priests, and the extended cousins of the royal family who claimed they weren't that into politics while absolutely being that into politics. These homes were different. They had furniture. They had stone floors. They had actual kitchens, not just fire pits. And they had servants, lots of servants, who did the cooking, of course. No one who owned land and linen was stirring lentils by hand.
Meals here were abundant. Multiple courses. Fish, poultry, beef. Nothing was off limits. The beer was cleaner. The wine was stronger. And, yes, the sand content was significantly lower. There were sauces, too, made with garlic, vinegar, dates, and sometimes a fermented fish paste that was probably a little intense on the nose. Still, it added flavor, which was more than the farmers could say about their mashed onions. They also had desserts, honey cakes, figs stuffed with nuts, date wine, and fruit, lots of fruit, grapes, pomegranates, melons, all seasonal, of course, but the Nile Valley was generous. If you had money and servants, you could eat like someone's favorite god. And if you were actually serving the gods, as a priest, well, you were basically entitled to their offerings. Which brings us to temple dining. Picture this, a vast temple courtyard, incense floating on the breeze, stone columns painted with bright colors that are now long gone but were once obnoxiously vivid. Behind the scenes, priests are making offerings, daily, sometimes hourly. To keep the gods satisfied, the temple kitchens cooked up meat,
bread, beer, wine, and cakes. Most of it was placed before a statue for ceremonial consumption and then, conveniently, eaten by the priests. Yes, being a god meant never having to lift a spoon. Being a priest, however, meant getting the leftovers. Not in a sad way, more like a divinely sanctioned lunch break. The amount of food that flowed through temples was absurd. Oxen, ducks, geese, breads of all shapes and sizes, jars of beer stacked like cereal boxes. And most of it was consumed by humans dressed in linen robes who claimed they were just messengers. And now we rise one more step to the palaces, to the banquets of the pharaohs, the full royal feast, where gold wasn't just a decorative accent, it was tableware. You drank wine from gold cups. You sniffed lotus flowers while reclining on ebony chairs inlaid with ivory. You didn't eat grapes. You had grapes peeled for you. And you had a band playing in the background because, obviously, these were banquets designed to impress. Rows of roast duck, cuts of beef dripping with sauce, pastries soaked in honey, exotic fruits, imported delicacies, and endless pitchers of wine. The guest list was as eat. High priests, top generals, royal family members who hadn't annoyed the pharaoh recently. It was more than a meal. It was a political performance, a way to show wealth, power, and divine favor through a buffet. And while all this was happening, somewhere not far away, a farmer was eating bread that tasted faintly of pebbles. So, when we last left off, the pharaoh was sipping date wine from a gold cup while pretending to be a living god, which, to be fair, was part of the job description. And while royal banquets dazzled with goose, beef, and enough honey-soaked pastries to make a dentist sob, you might be wondering who actually made all this food. Enter the palace kitchens.
Now, these were not quiet little rooms with a few pots on the fire. They were massive operations. Think open courtyards filled with clay ovens, roaring fires, piles of grinding stones, and servants running around with baskets of raw produce, dead ducks, and probably more stress than is healthy. There were bakers, brewers, butchers, and cooks. And then there were supervisors, because no one in history has ever trusted a cook to just do the thing without being watched by at least 3 other people holding clipboards. And these kitchens weren't just churning out food for the royal family. They fed everyone in the palace: servants, guards, scribes, minor wives, more servants, someone's cousin, probably a pet baboon. The palace was basically a small city, and the food had to flow constantly. If the bread ran out, someone was getting demoted. If the wine ran dry, well, let's just say that was a crisis on par with invasion. Of course, palace food was top tier. Animals were raised on royal estates specifically for eating. Cattle, goats, geese, ducks. They were fattened, pampered, and eventually sacrificed to the culinary gods, aka the pharaoh's lunch plate. Fish came in fresh from the Nile, though it had to be carefully prepared. Some species were considered sacred, others suspiciously stinky. And then there were the sauces: sweet, sour, salty, made with honey, dates, vinegar, fermented fish, which might sound horrible, but was apparently very trendy at the time. The ancient Egyptian palate was complex. They liked contrasts: sweet with savory, crunchy with soft, and they really liked garlic. Meanwhile, the staff who cooked it all, they got the leftovers, if they were lucky. There's a reason ancient Egyptian texts have a lot of grumbling from workers about rations. Imagine making roast goose with apricot sauce all day and then going home to barley stew that tastes like lukewarm bath water.
Morale was, well, variable. Now let's float somewhere a little darker. Not emotionally, just literally darker, as in underground. Because as much as Egyptians loved feasting in life, they were just as committed to feasting in death, which is a strange but consistent theme in ancient Egypt. The afterlife was just life again, but with slightly more magic and fewer taxes. When someone died, especially someone important, their tomb wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was a house, a furnished, decorated, food-stocked house. The walls were painted with elaborate scenes, the deceased sitting before heaping piles of bread, beer, meat, vegetables, fruits, everything they could possibly want, drawn in neat little rows. Because in Egyptian belief, these painted offerings could become real in the afterlife. You didn't need a fridge, you just needed good art direction. But Egyptians didn't just rely on artistic interpretation, oh no. They packed actual food too. Loaves of bread, dried meat, onions, jars of wine, cones of incense, entire roast ducks in some cases. Archaeologists have opened tombs to find 4,000-year-old loaves of bread, still sort of intact. One even found a slab of beef jerky that had been sealed so well it looked almost edible. Not recommended, but impressive. And it wasn't just for kings. Wealthy middle-class folks, scribes, artisans, priests, often had their own small tombs, stocked with snacks. Because nothing says eternal rest like a dusty piece of cake you've had since 1890 BCE. The most famous example, of course, is Tutankhamun. When his tomb was discovered in 1922, it was crammed full of treasures, and among them, food. Dozens of jars of wine, labeled with vintage and vineyard like a divine sommelier had been consulted. Boxes of dates, dried meats, even a few loaves of bread, baked into animal shapes. All for a king who died at 19 and was probably too inbred to chew properly. But hey, it's the thought that counts. And here's the slightly tragic part. While all this food was meant to sustain the deceased forever, the Ka, the spiritual essence, could only enjoy it if someone kept offering it. Which meant that long after a person died, their family had to keep visiting the tomb, bringing fresh offerings, saying the right prayers. If they stopped, well, then you just had ghost hunger. No eternal banquet, just sad spiritual leftovers.
So to prevent that, some tomb owners got clever. They had eternal offering texts carved on their tomb walls. These were little prayers or menus, basically, that said bread, beer, cattle, fowl, all good things. And they were supposed to work automatically. Set it and forget it. A post-mortem subscription plan. Honestly, very efficient. Meanwhile, back in the land of the living, food continued to flow through every level of society. Religious festivals meant big public feasts, especially in honor of gods like Osiris, who was basically the god of death, resurrection, and all-you-can-eat funerary buffets. During festivals, temples distributed bread, beer, and maybe some meat to the crowds. A little public relations, a little divine favor, a lot of carbs. And if you were elite, feasting was still a political tool. Inviting the right people to dinner could secure alliances, impress rivals, and quietly signal that yes, you had enough grain to waste on stuffing dates with walnuts. The visual of abundance mattered. Wealth was measured in cattle, wine jars, and how many servants you had fanning you while you dipped your bread in date syrup. But of course, not everyone got to dine like a demigod. The gap between rich and poor was very real. While the nobility nibbled on honey duck, many laborers were chewing on hard bread that might break a tooth. Still, the system functioned thanks to the Nile, the farmers, and an unwavering belief that food was sacred. Even the gods had favorite dishes. Some preferred roast goose, others liked beer. Offerings had to be precise, and if you got it wrong, say, gave beef to a fish god, you didn't get cursed exactly, but you definitely get side-eyed by the priesthood. Ritual dining was a serious business.
Let's slowly step away from the tombs now. The torches are burning low, the beer jars are empty, and the offerings have been made. The feast, both literal and symbolic, is over for tonight, but the smell of garlic and incense still lingers. So, you're an ancient Egyptian priest, which means you wake up absurdly early, you smell faintly of incense and lake water, and your daily planner reads, bathe, burn things, feed the gods, repeat. Because yes, feeding the gods was a full-time job, multiple shifts, lots of hand-washing, zero room for improvisation. Let's ease our way into a typical temple morning. It's dawn in Thebes. The sky is a pale pink. The birds are being loud, as usual. Somewhere a farmer is already yelling at an ox. But inside the massive stone walls of the Temple of Amun, things are quiet, sacred, ritualized. You, the priest, have already bathed in cold water several times. You're wearing freshly laundered linen, bleached white, no color allowed, and your hair has been shaved clean because apparently scalp hygiene is sacred now. The temple is a city unto itself. Storerooms, granaries, kitchens, breweries, bakeries, animal pens, scribes, dancers, musicians, administrators who live for spreadsheets. This isn't just a building, it's a divine economy, humming along like a well-oiled chariot wheel. And at the center of it all, hidden behind thick doors, in a room no one else can enter, is a statue. Just a statue, stone, metal, wood, doesn't move, doesn't speak, but it's the god, or at least the vessel for the god's presence, Amun, or Ptah, or Horus, depending on the temple. And your job is to feed him, or her, or them, without error, without delay, without getting any smudges on the offering tray. Breakfast for a god starts early. The first offering is usually incense, because apparently deities are very into aromatherapy. Frankincense, myrrh, and copal, burned slowly, waved politely, and not so much inhaled as gently endured. Then comes water, pure, cool, and symbolic of life, poured into bowls and placed beside the shrine. Then finally, the food. And let's be clear, this was actual food, prepared by actual temple cooks. We're talking loaves of bread, freshly baked and still warm, jars of beer, frothy and fragrant, roasted meats, if the temple could afford it, fruits, vegetables, maybe a nice honey cake if it was a special day. Everything arranged on offering tables in symmetrical order, because even the gods apparently liked neat plating.
Now, the statue didn't actually eat anything. No tiny god mouth opened up and nibbled a fig. But the Egyptians believed that the spiritual essence of the food was absorbed. The Ka, that mysterious life force, took what it needed. And once that invisible nibbling was complete, the food was removed. And then eaten. By the priests. Naturally. This was called reversion of offerings. It's one of those terms that sounds oddly technical for something that's basically, we gave it to the god first, now we'll have the leftovers. But it worked. It kept the temple staff fed and the gods presumably satisfied. And this happened multiple times a day. Morning, midday, and evening. Ritual after ritual. The god was bathed with scented water, dressed in linen robes, offered makeup. Yes, makeup. And perfumes. And then more food. If you think temple priests had it easy, think again. They were on a permanent loop of divine pampering. The temple kitchens were massive. They had their own dedicated staff, people who did nothing but grind flour, brew beer, roast meat, and wash dishes. And everything had to be pure. That meant clean ingredients, clean hands, clean everything. If a fly landed on the bread, it wasn't just gross, it was spiritually offensive. Into the discard pile it went, or possibly onto a less holy plate. Let's not speculate. There were sacred recipes too, not in the modern here's my food blog way, but in the form of rituals. Certain festivals had specific offerings. Osiris liked onions. Hathor liked beer and music. Bastet probably wanted something crunchy. Each deity had their preferences, and ignoring them was a great way to get absolutely smote. And some temples were filthy rich. Land grants, donations, taxation privileges. They had whole agricultural estates sending in food as tribute. Grain, cattle, fruit, honey, wine. The Temple of Amun at Karnak, for example, was essentially a feudal powerhouse disguised as a house of worship. It owned fleets of boats, managed warehouses, and ran more efficiently than most modern government departments. Of course, someone had to keep track of it all. That's where the scribes came in. Always the scribes. Pale little men with sharp reeds and sharper pens, sitting in shaded offices calculating how many loaves went to which offering, how many ducks were delivered that week, and how much beer was owed to the priests on duty. Somewhere, there's probably a 3,000-year-old spreadsheet that reads 14 loaves of bread, Amun, 2 cakes, Hathor, an apology note, Sobek, crocodile escaped again. And if you're picturing all this in hushed silence, think again. Temple life was noisy. There were musicians performing ritual songs, dancers spinning in ceremonial circles, drums pounding, sistrums shaking. The offerings were made with full sound design because apparently gods, like everyone else, needed a good soundtrack with their meals. But the gods weren't the only ones watching. The general population, while not allowed into the inner sanctuary, knew what went on. They brought their own offerings to temple gates, hoping for blessings, healing, maybe a bit of divine favoritism. Bread, beer, onions, simple things, but from the heart. They didn't get the same ceremonial feast, but they were part of the system, worship by proximity, by participation, and it kept the spiritual economy going. And this happened for centuries, every day, every festival, every reign. Through famines, floods, dynastic drama, and at least 6 pharaohs who thought they were literally Ra reincarnated. The gods had to be fed, no exceptions. Even when the political system collapsed, temples tried to keep the offerings going, because no one wanted to be the guy responsible for letting the sun god go hungry. Eventually, the old gods faded. New religions came. The temples crumbled. The offerings stopped. But the idea that food is sacred, that feeding someone is a holy act, never really went away. It just changed costumes. For now, though, let's leave the temple kitchens behind. The fires are burning low. The last offering of the evening has been placed. The god is presumably full. The priests are finishing their third helping. And somewhere nearby, a scribe is writing it all down.
The market was not quiet. It never was. Even at sunrise, when the light was still soft and the sand barely warm underfoot, the vendors were already yelling. Not in anger, just tradition. The louder you were, the more onions you sold. It wasn't glamorous. The ancient Egyptian market was dusty, crowded, and smelled aggressively like fish, spices, and people who'd been awake too long. It was the heartbeat of daily life, squeezed into narrow alleys or open courtyards, depending on how generous the architecture was feeling. And it was always full. Farmers, bakers, potters, priests sneaking in on their lunch breaks, tired women carrying baskets, children with suspiciously sticky hands. Everything was for sale. Except dignity. That one had already been bartered away, probably in exchange for a slightly overripe fig. The currency was mostly barter. Technically, there were rings of copper, silver, and even gold, but most people didn't have them. What they had was grain, especially barley, measured in sacks or hekats. If you wanted a loaf of bread, it might cost you a scoop of barley. If you wanted a jug of beer, maybe 2 scoops. If you were clever, you brought last season's lentils and tried to trade up. Everyone was hustling. Everyone had an angle. And yes, there were actual prices. Sort of. Ancient receipts carved into potsherds or scribbled on papyrus still exist. They read like extremely patient grocery lists. 1 goose, 8 measures of barley. 1 jar of honey, 10. 1 whole ox, please consult your local priest. Vendors sat on mats or low stools. Some stood behind wooden stalls. Others squatted in the sand with baskets piled high. Onions, garlic, leeks, bunches of fresh herbs tied with string, fish so soft they barely held their shape, dates
so dry that they could survive another dynasty. Fish, salted or fresh, laid out on palm fronds that did nothing to hide the smell. Bread of all shapes, flat, round, oval, triangular, shaped like animals if you wanted to impress someone. Most of it was rock hard by mid-morning. There were spice sellers too, not as common. Their goods were expensive, often imported. Cinnamon from somewhere mysterious, cumin, coriander, mustard seeds that clung to your fingers. The spice sellers usually had better sandals and worse attitudes. And there were the meat sellers, loud, proud, flies everywhere. They displayed cuts of goat, slabs of beef, sometimes whole geese plucked and hanging, not always fresh, but aggressively advertised as such. Some meat came from temple surplus, sacrificial leftovers repurposed as weekday dinner. If it smelled like incense, you were getting the premium cut. Nearby, a baker was arguing, again, about the flour. Too coarse, too sandy, not enough rise. As if ancient Egyptian bread was ever fluffy. Still, the customers were fussy. Everyone was. The beer was too warm, the onions too green, the honey too crystallized. Nothing was perfect, except the gossip, which flowed freely. Markets were where everything was exchanged, including news. Who was marrying whom? Who died last night? Which official got caught with an extra cow on his grain report? Whether the Nile flood would be good this year? Whether the priest's cousin had eloped with a temple dancer? Whether the pharaoh was still building his tomb or finally moving in? It all mattered, and it was all shared between bites of cheese and sips of weak beer. Not everything sold was edible. There were oil vendors, linseed, castor, sesame, used for cooking, lamps, or anointing whichever body part needed attention. There were ceramics, jars of every size, most of them chipped but still usable. Cloth, mostly linen, stacked in faded bundles or fluttering from poles. Some people sold cosmetics, coal, red ochre, scented resins. Because even if you smelled like fish and sweat, your eyeliner still had to be sharp. Children darted between stalls, usually in the way, sometimes helpful, sometimes thieves. Vendors watched them with suspicion, or tolerance, or both. Cats slinked under baskets, dogs napped in patches of shade. A donkey brayed somewhere off to the side, objecting to absolutely nothing. It was chaotic. It was noisy. It was essential. The market was how cities breathed. Without it, the temples wouldn't have onions, the priests wouldn't have lunch, and the gods would probably get moody.
And at the edge of the market sat the beer sellers, always near the edges, probably because they caused trouble. Their stalls were half tavern, half negotiation booth. People came to drink, loudly discuss trade deals, and forget their problems. The beer was thick, more like soup, and probably a little sour by noon. It came in ceramic jugs with no handles. You drank it through a straw to avoid the clumps. It was warm, it was filling, and if you had enough of it, the market started to sound almost poetic. Some beer sellers were women. Some were widows. Some were clever entrepreneurs. The records don't say much, but they were clearly doing well. The kind of well that comes with 6 jars of barley and a crowd of sweaty scribes waiting for their turn. Every so often, a tax collector passed through. Not to buy anything, of course. Just to take notes, to count stalls, to gently remind the vendors that the temple needed its share. There was no real way to avoid it. If you were selling, someone was taxing. If you weren't selling, someone was still taxing. It was a delicate system, propped up by grain and the assumption that no one would stab anyone before sundown. There were no signs, no prices displayed. Everything was verbal, a test of patience, performance, and how well you knew your neighbor's sister's cousin who worked in the granary. If you were lucky, you got a fair deal.
If not, you walked home with fish that might outlive you. By afternoon, the market sagged under the heat. The bread hardened. The beer curdled slightly. The vendors slumped in their stalls, fans waving slowly. Children fell asleep in baskets. Cats disappeared into the alleys. The gossip slowed, but never stopped. And eventually the market closed. Not officially. There were no clocks, no opening hours, but naturally. The sun dipped, the shadows stretched, the last onions were sold. The bread, too stale to move, was quietly eaten. And the vendors packed up their baskets, adjusted their sandals, and went home. Tomorrow they'd be back, with more bread, more fish, more barley, more complaints, more laughter. The same arguments about flour, but with slightly more drama. The same beer, but hopefully colder. The market always returned. It was as predictable as the Nile and twice as noisy. The tombs didn't echo, not really. They breathed differently. The air was dry, still, older than any bread still left uneaten. These were not places built for visitors. They were meant for the dead, and for the things the dead might want to snack on. Egyptian tombs weren't graves, not in the modern sense. They were houses, elaborate, decorated, stone-walled homes designed to last forever. Because forever, in ancient Egypt, wasn't poetic, it was logistical. Your soul needed somewhere to stay, somewhere to rest, eat, and enjoy a slightly exaggerated version of your earthly life. And nothing exaggerated a life quite like a dining scene, carved in low relief. The tomb of a wealthy Egyptian didn't just include a body, it included menus, painted offerings, sculpted loaves, carved cattle, geese frozen mid-flap, banquet tables groaning under the weight wine jars and garlic bundles, whole feasts laid out in ochre and lapis. The food wasn't real, but in the Egyptian worldview, real was flexible. If it was drawn well, labeled correctly, and ritually activated, it counted. That's theology and convenience in one brushstroke. Still, they didn't take chances. Alongside the paintings, tombs were stocked with actual food. Bread loaves sealed in jars, dried meats wrapped in linen, onions, garlic, chickpeas, lentils, jars of beer stoppered with clay, occasionally cheese, which had a regrettable tendency to ferment in weird directions, and wine, red, white, sweet, spiced, sealed and labeled with the vineyard, the year, and which estate steward was responsible, in case the afterlife had customer service. Some of these offerings were symbolic. Others were leftovers from the funeral feast itself. And some were just generous panic packing. If your family had any money, they buried you with enough food to cater for at least the first century of eternity, just in case the spiritual version didn't load properly.
Then there were models, tiny ceramic or wooden replicas of bakeries, breweries, butcher shops, figurines pounding grain, stirring pots, pouring beer into jars. These weren't toys, they were labor-saving devices. Because why should your ka have to cook every day in the afterlife? Just outsource it, miniature style. The richest tombs went all out. Entire kitchens carved into the walls, floor-to-ceiling lists of offerings, each item detailed. Bread of fine flour, bread of coarse flour, beer made of red grain, beer made of barley, wine, cakes, dates, figs, roast goose, trussed duck, ox leg, ribs, kidneys, onions, leeks, coriander, salt, oil, honey, and about 7 kinds of incense just to keep things fragrant. All listed, all included. No one wanted to be the ghost haunting someone else's tomb because they forgot the chickpeas. Even the phrasing mattered. Offering formulae had to be inscribed just so. Usually something like, an offering which the king gives and Anubis approves, followed by the menu. Standardized, stylized, official. It was less a prayer, more a receipt. But it worked. It told the gods, this person gets food, every day, forever. Poor tombs had to make do. A few jars, maybe a basket of grain, sometimes just a stela with an offering scene and a short request. Please send bread and beer, essentially. Simple, hopeful, probably ignored, but you had to try. The royal tombs, of course, were on another level entirely. The Valley of the Kings wasn't a humble cemetery, it was a necropolis of aggressively secure retirement homes for the divine. Pharaohs were buried with entire storerooms of food. Tutankhamun, despite his early and not very impressive reign, had jars upon jars of wine. Dozens, all labeled. Several with descriptions like, very good wine, which raises questions about the rest. He also had baskets of dates, boxes of dried meats, and oddly, a loaf of bread shaped like a hedgehog. No one knows why. Maybe he liked hedgehogs. Maybe his baker had a sense of humor. Maybe it was symbolic. Probably no one asked, because when you're baking for the king's eternal journey, you don't take feedback. The food was stored in sealed jars, many of which survived intact for over 3,000 years. When archaeologists opened them, they found dried fruit, desiccated meat, and something that might have once been cheese but now resembled regret. Still, it was impressive. Eternal preservation wasn't just for bodies. The labels on wine jars are particularly charming. They include the vineyard name, the year of production, the type of wine, and the winemaker's name. Some even included quality rankings. Excellent, good, occasionally good enough, probably from the same intern who labeled the onion baskets. It wasn't all food, though. There were scented oils, perfumes, and cosmetics, because the afterlife wasn't just about nourishment, it was about presentation. You had to show up looking and smelling your best, even if you were alone in a tomb with a mummified duck. And speaking of mummies, animals got their own funerary meals too. Sacred cats, ibis birds, and crocodiles were buried with offerings. Sometimes their tombs included food, sometimes not. Depends on the budget, and how much the priests liked you. But back to the humans, over time, especially in the later periods, real food offerings became less common. Economic pressure, political instability, a general decline in ritual budgeting. So people leaned more on artwork, on texts. If you couldn't afford a real duck, you carved one. If you couldn't afford a proper feast, you wrote down the list and hoped the gods were feeling generous. Some tried to cheat the system. Tomb robbers obviously took the real food, but even in life, some tomb builders skimped on materials. Plaster instead of stone. A smaller list of offerings. Less garlic, more papyrus. But the belief remained, if it's written, it exists. And so the tradition continued, for millennia, through dynasties, droughts, wars, and occasional peasant revolts. Egyptians kept burying their dead with food, because hunger was undignified, even in death, especially in death. And somewhere, deep in the sand, sealed behind stone, are still loaves of bread, jars of honey, bundles of dried onions, and bottles of wine with labels that read, "Good enough for a god." The gods, as it turns out, were picky eaters.
You'd think that being immortal sky beings with control over floods, plagues, and the occasional inconvenient eclipse would make them a little more flexible at dinner time. But no, in ancient Egypt, each deity had a very specific taste, and woe to the priest who offered the wrong snack. Let's start with Ra, the sun god, who presumably burned his toast every morning. He wasn't fussy about offerings, but he liked the usual package: bread, beer,
incense, and silence. You didn't shout around Ra's shrine, you wafted nicely, preferably while facing east and pretending not to notice the enormous flaming disk rolling across the sky. Then there was Osiris, the god of death, the afterlife, resurrection, grain, and basically any seasonal metaphor you could fit into a myth. Osiris liked offerings that symbolized renewal. Bread made from sprouted grain, onions, fresh vegetables. He was also partial to lettuce. Yes, lettuce, which the Egyptians considered an aphrodisiac because, of course they did. Some kinds of lettuce, when cut, release a milky sap, and that was enough symbolism to keep the priesthood entertained for generations. Hathor, goddess of love, music, and extremely confident eyeliner, enjoyed beer, honey, and sweet pastries. Her festivals were lively. Drums, dancing, public intoxication, a few regrettable decisions. The beer flowed freely and the offerings were shared widely. If you wanted a divine hangover, Hathor was your girl. Bastet, the cat goddess, received fish, small birds, jars of milk occasionally. Nothing fancy, but always neat. You did not mess up Bastet's altar. No crumbs, no spills, no bad vibes. If anyone was going to judge your plating skills, it was her. Now, Sobek, the crocodile god, was a different story. His temples kept actual crocodiles, fed them like royalty, and buried them in custom sarcophagi. Some even had jewelry. The offerings? Usually meat, preferably fresh, occasionally live. And while there's no written record of Sobek critiquing the spice level of a roast duck, we can assume he had opinions. Of course, not all gods accepted meat. Some preferred vegetarian offerings, particularly during certain festivals when meat was restricted and only bread, fruits, vegetables, and incense were allowed. It wasn't about ethics. It was about ritual cycles, seasons, cosmic balance, which meant that even the gods had cheat days and fasting periods. Then there were the forbidden foods, items so sacred or so cursed that touching them outside of ritual could get you spiritually side-eyed. For instance, pork. Pigs were common in ancient Egypt, especially among farmers. They were efficient garbage disposals, didn't complain much, and could survive on very little. But religiously, pigs were awkward. Some gods tolerated them. Most didn't. By the New Kingdom, pigs were borderline taboo in temple contexts. They were associated with Set, the god of chaos, storms, and family drama. So offering pork to the wrong deity was basically sending a message that said, "I misunderstood everything about you, but here's some bacon anyway." Even fish, so plentiful along the Nile, could be religiously complicated. Certain temples avoided them entirely. In others, they were sacred. It depended on location, mythology, and probably the local priest's personal trauma. One myth said that the fish swallowed Osiris's body part, the one part that got lost after he was chopped up. So fish were off the menu in those regions, out of respect.
There were also seasonal taboos. During key festivals, especially in the later dynasties, certain foods were banned altogether. Eating them at the wrong time wasn't just a faux pas, it was cosmic sabotage. You didn't want to be the guy who triggered a drought because he snacked on the wrong kind of bread during the Feast of the Valley. Some offerings were symbolic beyond ingredients. Loaves came in different shapes, each tied to a purpose. Conical for daily sustenance, flat and round for funerals, animal-shaped for celebration. There were loaves shaped like ducks, crocodiles, even hedgehogs again. Apparently someone in the ancient bakery department had a thing for hedgehogs. The priests who prepared these offerings did so with strict rules. No cutting corners, no spoiled grain,
If you messed up the bread, you didn't just embarrass yourself, you risked offending the divine. The penalty was rarely lightning bolts. More often it was reassignment to jar cleaning duty for a month. And then there was incense, the silent food of the gods. Burned, not eaten, but essential. It cleansed the air, marked sacred time, and probably covered up the smell of fish in summer. Frankincense, myrrh, kifi, a mixture of herbs, honey, raisins, and wine pressed into pellets and burned slowly. Kifi was the ancient Egyptian version of a scented candle, relaxing, vaguely edible, and required at all upscale temples. One curious offering was the false door. Not a food item, obviously, but related. These were carved into tomb walls, painted and inscribed, symbolizing the passage between worlds. The living could place offerings there, and the dead were believed to pass through to receive them. It was architectural magic, no hinges required. And what happened to the offerings after they'd been consumed spiritually? Most of them were eaten by the priests, or redistributed to temple staff, or given to the poor during festivals. It wasn't wasteful, it was efficient. The gods took the essence. The humans took the calories, except in rare cases when offerings were burned entirely. Total consumption, no leftovers, usually for very sacred or very angry deities, or when someone felt like making a point. The offerings also had ranking. There were first-tier gifts, bread, beer, meat, incense. Then second-tier, fruits, vegetables, flowers. Then third-tier, symbolic tokens, carvings, or foods given only in name. Everything had a place. Nothing was random. Not in a culture where balance ruled everything. Even feasts for the dead followed divine protocol. The funerary meal, held after burial, included foods carefully chosen to nourish the soul on its journey. Bread, beer, roasted meats, sometimes wine, shared among mourners, not just to honor the dead, but to feed the living, keep the cycle going, and make sure the ka didn't wander off looking for better hospitality. Because even in the afterlife, you wanted to be well fed, and ideally remembered by people who didn't skimp on the wine. The festival calendar in ancient Egypt was predictably full. There were gods to honor, seasons to mark, floods to anticipate, pharaohs to praise, and occasionally enemies to mock. And every single one of these occasions came with food, usually a lot of it, sometimes too much. If you were a priest, it meant more work. If you were a farmer, it meant slightly less. If you were a guest, you just hoped there was still beer left by the time you arrived. One of the biggest festivals was the Feast of Opet, celebrated in Thebes. It involved moving the statue of the god Amun from the Karnak temple to the Luxor temple, across town, by river barge, accompanied by music, incense, chanting, and a lot of coordinated choreography from priests in very hot linen robes. The festival lasted for days. The food lasted slightly longer.
Huge amounts of bread, beer, fruit, and meat were prepared. These were consumed by priests, temple workers, and in some cases, the public. Not everyone got the goose, of course. Some just got a loaf of coarse barley bread and a half cup of warm beer. But still, it was something. And then there was the beautiful Feast of the Valley, essentially a mass picnic with the dead. Families would cross the Nile, visit the tombs of their ancestors, and bring offerings: bread, beer, cakes, onions, maybe a goose if Uncle Nebi had a good harvest that year. They'd sit outside the tomb, talk to the dead, sing, eat, cry a little, and drink probably too much. The dead were believed to join the meal spiritually. No one asked too many questions about how that worked. Food at festivals wasn't just celebratory, it was symbolic. the type of bread, the ingredients, even the shape. Some loaves were shaped like ankhs, the symbol of life. Others like eyes, ducks, or lotus flowers. Everything meant something. You didn't just bring food, you brought meaning, preferably in pastry form. But not every feast was joyful. Sometimes the food wasn't for celebration, but for survival. Egypt's dependence on the Nile made it powerful and fragile. The river flooded every year, usually. When it didn't, people suffered. Crops failed, granaries ran low, prices climbed, and suddenly the meals got very quiet. In bad years, the state tried to step in. Temples handed out rations, grain from royal stores was distributed. Bread and beer production was increased, but it wasn't always enough. During famines, people ate what they could: dried legumes, wild plants, roots, sometimes sawdust mixed into flour to stretch it, sometimes clay. Not ideal. There are even records, quiet, sorrowful ones, that mention boiled leather, and in the worst cases, darker rumors. But the stories written down, the ones carved on tomb walls and hidden in temple archives, don't focus on that. They focus on recovery, on grain returning, on bread baking again. The belief that in time, the gods would provide, the Nile would rise, the ovens would heat, the beer would ferment just enough to be drinkable again. And through it all, the rituals continued. Even in lean years, priests still placed offerings, even if the bread was smaller, even if the beer was thin. The ceremonies didn't stop, because stopping would mean admitting the world was broken. And the Egyptians weren't ready to do that, not while there was still flour to grind. And still people remembered. Even centuries later, in the Greco-Roman period, long after the old gods had been quietly nudged aside by new ones, Egyptian families still honored the dead with food offerings, still painted loaves of bread in tombs, still buried their loved ones with jars of grain and a carefully wrapped cake, just in case. The gods changed, the rituals faded, but the food remained. In a way, ancient Egypt was one long banquet, a slow, deliberate feast stretched over millennia, from the muddy fields of the Delta to the shadowed corridors of the Valley of the Kings, from the farmer's cracked clay bowl to the pharaoh's gold inlaid goblet. They feasted to live, they feasted to honor, they feasted to remember. And now all that's left are the crumbs in the sand, the smell of old incense on tomb walls, and jars sealed 3,000 years ago, still waiting to be opened.
Now, we begin with something gentle, soothing, familiar, large, slow-moving, and usually adorable. An elephant. Because tonight's story is not about circus tricks or jungle adventures. It's about state violence, but sleepy, institutional punishment, but weirdly majestic, and elephants, always elephants. This is execution by elephant, the forgotten punishment of South Asia. Hey guys, tonight, we begin with something gentle, soothing, familiar, large, slow-moving, and usually adorable. An elephant. And then we slowly ruin that image for you. Because tonight's story is not about circus tricks or jungle adventures. It's about state violence, but sleepy, institutional punishment, but weirdly majestic, and elephants, always elephants. So go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe imagine you're somewhere warm, with the smell of cardamom in the air and the gentle sound of ankle bells in the distance. Just ignore the fact that someone, somewhere, is definitely about to be trampled to death. Because yes, tonight we're gliding into the oddly dignified, occasionally ceremonial, definitely over-the-top world of execution by elephant. A punishment so slow, so deliberate, and so spectacularly theatrical that it somehow lasted over 2,000 years. across kingdoms, across cultures, across emperors who apparently looked at a 6,000-pound herbivore and thought, yes, that's my guillotine. Let's start in South Asia, where this whole regal circus really took off. Elephants, of course, have been part of South Asian life for thousands of years. Domesticated, trained, and sometimes mildly worshipped. They were war machines, status symbols, jungle bulldozers, and occasionally, executioners. Because why use a sword when you've got a walking tank with tusks? The practice, known by various regional names, was especially common in parts of India, Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia, and it wasn't some chaotic improvisation. It was formalized. The elephants were trained. The execution methods were chosen. The crowd was invited. There was a whole vibe. The earliest mentions go back to ancient Indian texts, especially the Manusmriti, one of the oldest and most infamously specific legal codes, which suggested elephants as a valid tool for punishment. And to be fair, the Manusmriti suggested a lot of things, most of them deeply unpleasant. But it's still a peek into how this wasn't just a random act of cruelty, it was law, order, animal-assisted justice. Now, before we start imagining elephants gleefully stomping people for fun, let's clarify, these weren't wild elephants. They were royal, trained, intelligent, decorated, sometimes. They wore armor, bells, painted symbols. They didn't just trample someone because they were in a bad mood. They followed commands, usually from a mahout, the trainer, who had one of the most niche jobs in history, turning an elephant into a high-precision instrument of state punishment. The executions varied. Sometimes it was simple. A criminal laid on the ground, a signal given, and a single, solemn stomp. Sometimes it wasn't, because sometimes the elephant was trained to prolong the event, to drag the victim, to crush limbs slowly, to push, to kneel, to delay the fatal blow for dramatic effect. The ruler could signal when to end it, or whether to end it at all. Some elephants were trained to behead. Yes, really, using their tusks, or pressing the neck just right with a foreleg. Again, very calm, very controlled. Just a royal pachyderm with disturbingly good aim. And then there were the theatrical touches. In some kingdoms, the elephant would knock the criminal down, then wait, as if pausing for royal approval. Sometimes the victim would be tossed in the air first, or flung across the courtyard. Because nothing says absolute monarchy like a 12-foot mammal playing with its food. One of the most famous practitioners was the Mughal Empire, especially under Emperor Akbar, who, let's be honest, had a lot going on. Religious reforms, military campaigns, a sprawling court full of poets, warriors, and people pretending not to notice that Akbar occasionally handed out death sentences to his enemies using elephants. Akbar didn't just use elephants. He allegedly rode them during executions. As in, sat on top while it happened. Like some kind of very calm, very well-dressed referee. There are accounts of him using elephants to crush enemies, rivals, or traitors, publicly, in the capital. And he wasn't the only one. Raja Sir Phoji II of Tanjavur in South India also made headlines, albeit historical ones, for using elephants to execute criminals in full public view. Not because he had no other options, but because he wanted to send a message. Elephants didn't just kill. They humiliated. They drew crowds. They reminded everyone that mercy was optional and spectacle was forever. This wasn't limited to emperors. Local rulers, provincial governors, sometimes even military commanders had access to execution elephants. And yes, it was usually reserved for serious crimes. Treason, rebellion, severe theft. But definitions of serious were flexible, especially if you annoyed the wrong noble. In some kingdoms, elephants were used alongside other punishments. First came public humiliation. Then came a trampling. Or, in a few charming cases, the elephant dance, where the condemned had to try and escape while the elephant chased them slowly around the courtyard, to the laughter and casual anxiety of the watching crowd. And speaking of crowds, these executions were public. Always. That was the point. This wasn't a quick behind-the-palace kind of punishment. This was theatre. Royal, brutal, slow-moving theatre. Everyone was invited. Everyone was expected to watch. Because nothing reinforced social order like watching someone get flattened by a walking temple. But here's the weird part. Sometimes, the elephants refused. Historical accounts occasionally mention execution elephants pausing, hesitating, even refusing to kill. Especially if they sensed something wrong. Or if they had a bond with the victim. Or, frankly, if they were just in a weird mood that day. And when that happened, things got awkward. Because now the king had to decide whether to override the elephant's conscience. Or interpret it as a divine sign. You haven't lived until you've read a royal account of a planned execution being cancelled because the elephant just didn't feel like it. It's the ancient version of a printer jamming during your big presentation. And that's where we'll leave it for now, just at the edge of the royal courtyard, where the elephant stands calm and the crowd holds its breath. Because this is only the beginning. There are still bejeweled tusks, imperial tantrums, and Southeast Asian variations to explore. We're not even done with Akbar. But for now, the elephant waits. Let's float gently back to the Mughal Empire, where the climate was warm, the palaces were large, and the method of execution was, still, an elephant. The Mughal court didn't do things halfway. Not architecture, not poetry, not murder, especially not Akbar. The same Akbar who promoted religious tolerance, abolished the jizya tax, encouraged arts, married several women of different faiths for diplomacy, and also, casually, had people trampled by elephants when he felt like making a point. Historical nuance. Anyone? Akbar wasn't impulsive with it. He was just casually symbolic. He believed in the idea of the just king, the emperor as a divine figure who embodied wisdom, mercy, and, when necessary, elephant-based justice. There are accounts of him commuting sentences at the last moment, or delaying the execution to let the condemned publicly confess, or riding the elephant himself, to ensure that justice was delivered with maximum imperial drama. In at least one instance, he reportedly pardoned a condemned man mid-trample. The elephant had already begun, then paused at Akbar's signal, and the man, probably still twitching, was hauled away to be healed and released. Message delivered. No one forgot it. But Akbar wasn't the only one in his dynasty to lean into the elephant method. Jahangir, his son and successor, also employed elephants in his justice system. There's a famous story, slightly embellished, as these things often are, where Jahangir, during a public execution, allegedly had the man dragged under the elephant's feet multiple times. Not killed, just injured. Repeatedly. For dramatic emphasis. He also wrote about it in his memoirs. Casually. Between discussions of hunting trips and wine preferences. Just a little note that yes, the criminal was dragged by an elephant today. Quite effective. Good results. In Mughal India, this wasn't just about punishment, it was about performance. Power needed to be visible. And what better way to make power visible than through a 12,000-pound mammal doing royal choreography in a public square? And yet, the method wasn't uniquely Mughal. Let's float a little further south. Across the sea, toward Sri Lanka, known historically as Lanka or Ceylon, depending on who was colonizing it at the time. The Sinhalese kings had their own royal elephants, and their own style of ceremonial execution. In Sri Lanka, elephants were deeply woven into society, religious life, agricultural work, state rituals, and yes, punishments. The courts of the Kandy kingdom, for instance, occasionally used trained elephants not just for death sentences, but for a more decorative kind of discipline. Think beheadings, or kneelings, or long, drawn-out stomping sessions with a side of moral lecture. European travelers to the region in the 16th and 17th centuries were horrified, and also kind of impressed. They wrote about it in grim detail. Apparently, the elephants in Sri Lanka were trained to delay the fatal blow, to hover, to tease. One letter describes an elephant placing its foot on a man's chest, waiting for the signal, then stepping back. Not because it was bored, because it had been taught to intimidate. Sri Lankan kings saw it as a moral punishment. You didn't just die, you reflected, under 6 tons of looming judgment. The crowd would watch, very still. The king would sit in state, entirely composed. And the elephant would wait, perfectly still, until the moment came. In some cases, the elephants were trained to dismember, using tusks, using chains, occasionally just using their sheer bulk. There are accounts, written by both locals and European observers, of criminals being pulled apart slowly, or stepped on limb by limb, or even thrown into the air like a particularly unlucky sack of wheat. And again, all of this was formal. There was a structure, a ritual, sometimes even a speech. This wasn't random violence. It was a moral spectacle. Everyone had a role. Now let's drift east for a moment, into Southeast Asia, where the kingdoms of Siam, Burma, and Cambodia also used execution elephants. The style was similar, but the pageantry often leaned even harder into sacred symbolism. In Thailand, especially during the Ayutthaya period, execution by elephant was not only legal, it was often considered honorable. A kind of royal send-off for traitors, rebels, or especially dramatic criminals. The elephants were dressed in regalia, bright fabrics, painted symbols, bells. The condemned would be marched in with ceremonial guards. There might be chanting. It was a scene. Sometimes, the elephants were made to crush the head as a sign of ending treachery. Other times, the chest, representing the heart of the rebellion. There were layers, messages, a sort of slow-motion political cartoon, drawn in footprints. European visitors in the 1600s and 1700s wrote about these events with a kind of horrified awe. They didn't understand the symbolism. They just saw giant animals stepping on humans. Which, fair enough. But what's interesting is how universal the training was. Across India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and even parts of Vietnam, the elephants weren't just used, they were taught. This wasn't instinct. This was engineering. You couldn't just hand an elephant a criminal and expect results. You needed discipline, patience, years of conditioning. And yes, there was a job title for this. The Mahout, a man trained from a young age to work with elephants. He knew the animal's moods, behaviors, limits. He also knew the commands, the signals, the exact tone of voice needed to say, "Now crush the leg," versus, "Wait for the king's nod." That's not something you pick up casually. The Mahout was part of the ritual. A silent guide. A soft-spoken executioner with a stick and a 1,000-yard stare. And while all of this sounds surreal from a modern perspective, at the time, it was normal. Expected. Feared. Yes. But not questioned. The elephant was part of royal life. Why wouldn't it be part of royal punishment? So the next time you see a peaceful elephant in a documentary, just remember, its great-great-grand elephant might have had a side hustle as a royal judge, jury, and extremely patient executioner. And somewhere, in a dusty courtyard, a ruler probably whispered, "Wait," while a trained elephant stood perfectly still, one massive foot hovering over someone who had just made one very serious political mistake. So, you're a European colonial officer in the 18th century. You've arrived in South or Southeast Asia with a deeply unfortunate hat, a vague belief in your own civilizing mission, and just enough Latin to annoy people. And then one morning, someone tells you there's going to be an execution in the palace courtyard. You go, naturally. That's what colonial officials did. Showed up, took notes, judged things, maybe drank something they couldn't pronounce. What you weren't expecting, at all, was a massive elephant, draped in silks, wearing gold bells, standing silently next to a man tied to a post. The crowd isn't screaming. No one seems panicked. In fact, people look impressed, interested. You're the only one sweating. The only one wondering, wait, is the elephant going to? Yes. Yes, it is. European accounts from the 1600s through the 1800s are full of mildly horrified, overly wordy observations about execution by elephant. The tone is always the same: cultural confusion, thinly veiled judgment, and a strong desire to write about it in excruciating detail for someone back in London or Paris. One example comes from Jean-Baptiste Taverny, a 17th-century French traveller, who described an execution in India where the elephant was instructed to crush the limbs of the condemned, one by one, before delivering the final blow. Taverny was shocked, but also fascinated. His writing has that very European tone of, "This is absolutely barbaric, but here's a detailed drawing and 3 pages of notes." Another account, from a British officer in Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, describes a similar scene: an elephant trained to press down with its foot, hold the man in place, then step back. The execution was delayed, repeated, performative. The officer was, understandably, unnerved, but also weirdly fixated. He described the mahout's commands, the elephant's posture, the reaction of the crowd, and then concluded, solemnly, that such practices were incompatible with enlightened rule. Of course, because for European colonizers, elephants weren't supposed to kill people. They were supposed to carry things, pose in paintings, maybe wear a crown during ceremonial parades. But execution? That was too theatrical, too emotional, too Eastern. And so, as colonial administrations expanded, British in India, Dutch in Indonesia, French in Indochina, the old methods came under scrutiny. The elephants became a problem. They were too symbolic, too traditional, too resistant to the sanitized, bureaucratic version of justice the Europeans wanted to install. Executions were supposed to be clean, preferably with a rifle or a rope, done quietly, behind closed doors, not with a giant animal and a cheering crowd. So, they started phasing them out, slowly, carefully, often over protests from local rulers who considered elephant executions a key part of their sovereign identity. It wasn't just a punishment, it was royal theatre. Taking it away felt like stripping the crown from the monarch's head. But the British, especially, were very committed to enforcing their version of law and order, one that didn't involve large mammals with crush commands. There are letters, petitions, administrative memos, all about elephants. One colonial administrator in Bengal wrote that the elephants used for punishment should be retrained for transport, or retired entirely, as if a creature trained to execute people for 20 years could just pivot to carrying bags of tea for the East India Company. Sure, that always goes well. Some elephants were quietly moved to military service, where their pasts were never discussed. Others remained in royal courts, no longer executing, but still heavily decorated, still surrounded by memory. And a few were sent to colonial zoos, where they were renamed, repainted, and put on display as curiosities. Their history forgotten, sanitized, traded for peanuts and awkward school groups. But the memory didn't vanish. Locals still told stories. Older people remembered the executions, the elephants, the crowd's hush, the sound of a footstep, heavy and final. It lingered. And even as the formal practice died out, the idea stayed alive. In folk tales, in paintings, in the quiet knowledge that once, not too long ago, justice didn't come from a judge's bench, but from the slow, deliberate weight of a royal elephant who knew exactly what to do and when to do it. And not all colonials were opposed. Some were simply confused, or resigned, or too overwhelmed by the sheer volume of things they didn't understand to bother banning one more ritual. Some officers even watched with curiosity, took notes, and tried to classify the executions. You know, for science, the elephant was labeled a judicial tool, or royal executor, or, in one particularly odd entry, a quadruped of grave utility. Which, I mean, technically true. But for the people watching, locals, royal officials, even the criminals themselves, it wasn't just about the elephant. It was about power. Real, physical, and undeniable. Power you could hear approaching, smell, feel through the ground as it walked. An elephant wasn't subtle. That was the point. It reminded everyone who ruled, and how serious that rule could get. And so, even as the British brought in their legal codes and colonial courts, the memory of execution by elephant refused to fully vanish. Because you can forget a hanging, but no one forgets a stomp. By the late 1800s, execution by elephant was already disappearing. Not all at once. Not in some final grand ceremony. It just tapered off. Quietly, slowly, like the end of a very long and elaborate festival no one was quite ready to leave. Colonial governments, particularly the British in India and the Dutch in Indonesia, had spent years nudging things along. Less royal spectacle. More paperwork. The old punishments were incompatible with modern administration. Which is a polite way of saying, we don't understand it and we'd like it to stop. Still, the elephants remained. Not as executioners anymore, but as parade animals, military assistants, or quiet relics of a different kind of justice. But the memories lingered. There are scattered accounts, very few, and always vague, of late 19th century executions by elephants still taking place in rural areas or semi-independent kingdoms, usually away from British eyes. Or, occasionally, with their reluctant permission, because no one wanted to start a diplomatic fight over one execution. In one case, in the princely state of Mysore, a man accused of treason was reportedly executed by an elephant as late as 1874. It's not confirmed. The records are hazy, but it shows that the memory of the practice was still alive, still possible, still real enough to be whispered about. Another faint echo comes from French Indochina, where some sources claim elephants were occasionally used to intimidate prisoners. Not to kill them, but to show that they could. It was theatre, still. Just quieter now. Fewer people clapping. And in Sri Lanka, even after formal executions ended, elephants remained part of royal ceremonies. Draped in gold, painted with symbols, walking slowly past temples and tombs. The public forgot the trampling. But not the elephant. By the early 20th century, the last of the execution elephants were either retrained, retired, or simply rebranded. No one wanted to talk about their past lives. They were mascots now, tourist attractions, members of temple processions. No one asked them what they remembered. And that's where the story might have ended. A forgotten footnote, an uncomfortable detail buried beneath the larger pages of colonial history. But execution by elephant refused to be erased completely. It resurfaced in books, in travel diaries, in footnotes of obscure legal texts. A curiosity, a strange, brutal, almost mythical idea, like something out of fiction, except fully real. Too real. Historians puzzled over it. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others traced its lineage, studying Mahout traditions, legal codes, and old murals with unsettlingly accurate depictions of elephants standing on people. The evidence wasn't dramatic. It was just consistent, quiet, undeniable. And in the background of all this, the elephants themselves. They never asked for this job. They weren't naturally violent. In fact, most were gentle, patient, intelligent. They had to be trained to do what they did, and untrained, when the time came, to stop. And yet, their presence still looms in the corners of history. A symbol of power, of spectacle, of control wrapped in ritual. They weren't just animals. They were instruments of state. Living reminders that justice, once upon a time, could be both ceremonial and crushing. And even now, centuries later, the memory lingers. In legends. In whispered stories. In the faint panic that rises in old texts when someone hears bells on an elephant's ankles and realizes they are not here for decoration. There's no clean moral here. No neat conclusion. Execution by elephant wasn't the product of barbarism. It was the product of structure. Of rulers who understood the power of symbolism. Of legal systems that believed fear should be public, dramatic, and slow. And yes, of animals who were too intelligent for the job they were given. Now the elephants walk in festivals. They carry gods instead of prisoners. They move through streets lined with phones and tourists and confetti. Their tusks are painted. Their feet are soft on pavement. No one claps anymore for the other kind of show. But history remembers. Not loudly. Not often. Just enough. Before we step into the flicker of northern fires, let's pause for a moment. Tonight's story is one of frenzy and ritual, of warriors who blurred the line between myth and man. It is a tale of storm, of mushrooms, and of mayhem. This is Viking berserkers, myth, mushrooms, and mayhem. We're talking about berserkers, the Viking warriors who were less soldier and more raging Norse chaos storm with absolutely no concept of personal space. But don't worry, tonight we're keeping it gentle. No screaming. Just a slow, sleepy walk through who these people were, what they did, and why medieval Scandinavia thought it was a good idea to give them weapons. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Maybe tuck a blanket around your legs like you're preparing for a longboat voyage, minus the frostbite. Tonight, we're exploring the myths, mushrooms, and mildly concerning social practices of Viking Age Scandinavia's most famous fight club. Let's start with the name. Berserker. It comes from Old Norse, ber meaning bear and circa meaning shirt. So, bear shirt. Or possibly bear shirt, depending on which medieval scholar you believe and how strongly you feel about the difference between grammar and fur. Either way, it suggests someone who fought without armor, or wore animal skins instead. Which, if you think about it, is not the vibe you want to see running at you across a battlefield. A large, screaming man in a wolf pelt with no pants? That's the moment your shield wall turns into a run wall. Berserkers show up in a lot of sagas, which, if you're new here, are those delightfully meandering Icelandic stories where people feud over cows for 17 chapters and then suddenly decapitate each other in a sentence and a half. In these sagas, berserkers are the wildcard characters, the uncles you don't invite to weddings, the guys who show up late to the feast, drink 12 horns of ale, and then challenge the host to a duel for looking at their sheep the wrong way. But they weren't just drunk guys with aggression issues. According to the sources, and again, we're using that word very generously, they were elite fighters, chosen warriors, sometimes royal bodyguards. The Norse kings didn't keep around berserkers because they were fun at parties. They kept them because once the berserkers started frothing, they didn't stop. They didn't feel pain. They didn't get tired. They didn't follow orders particularly well, but that was sort of the point. Going berserk wasn't a personality trait. It was a state. A transformation. Something that happened to you. The sagas describe it in various poetic and unhelpful ways. Men turning into beasts, biting their shields, howling like wolves, becoming immune to fire and iron. Which sounds ridiculous, because it is, but also deeply concerning if you're the one holding the enemy spear and realizing the thing running at you is actively foaming. Some accounts even mention berserkers entering this state before battle, like a warm-up. Imagine standing in a quiet field, waiting for war to start, and your elite warrior squad is over there headbutting rocks and yelling at the sun. That's morale boosting in a very specific direction. Now, were they real? Sort of. Probably. Maybe not exactly how the sagas say. Most historians agree that berserkers did exist, but not in the full mythological sense. They weren't werewolves. They didn't actually turn into bears. But they believed they did. And more importantly, everyone else believed it too. That's where the power was. If your reputation said you couldn't be hurt, if people whispered that you didn't feel pain, that you tore shields with your teeth, then a lot of opponents might not wait to test that theory. They'd just leave. Which is exactly what you want in a world where fights often came down to how many people ran away first. But it raises the obvious question, how did they do it? How did someone enter this berserk state? Was it trauma? Adrenaline? Vague Scandinavian magic? Or was it mushrooms? Yes, mushrooms. Specifically, Amanita muscaria, the little red one with white spots. Classic fairy tale fungus. Looks adorable. Possibly kills you. But if it doesn't, it might make you feel like you've turned into a fireproof bear with no sense of direction and very strong opinions about axes. Some scholars believe berserkers used mushrooms to fuel their rages. The theory goes like this: they'd eat the mushroom, wait for the hallucinogenic effects, then charge into battle during the peak of their trip. It explains the frothing, the confusion, the lack of pain. Also the occasional tendency to attack literally everyone, including their own side. It's a fun theory, but it has problems. First, Amanita muscaria is unpredictable. Sometimes it makes you euphoric. Sometimes it makes you nauseous. Sometimes it just makes you sit quietly and hum to yourself for several hours. Not exactly battlefield energy. Second, there's no clear mention of mushrooms in the actual sagas, which, granted, are not the most detailed medical texts, but still, you'd think someone might have said, "Oh yeah, they all ate those weird red things first." A competing theory, epilepsy, or mental illness, or even deliberate psychological conditioning, berserkers training themselves to enter a trance-like fury through breathwork, ritual, and sheer angry muscle memory, like ancient Norse Navy SEALs, but with worse hygiene. Or maybe it was just performance. You put on a bearskin. You scream. You pretend you're invincible. And if enough people believe it, you are. Either way, the effect was the same. Fear, confusion, retreat, and a lot of broken things. Let's float now to a place where berserkers became too much of a problem. Because when your elite warrior class starts ignoring royal commands, attacking guests, and challenging nobles to axe duels over seating arrangements, you don't have an army, you have a liability. And that's exactly what happened. But we'll settle into that quietly in part 2. For now, the bearskins are hanging by the fire. The shield has tooth marks. And somewhere in the corner, a berserker is still pacing in circles, waiting for the battle to start, even if it never does. So, you've got a berserker problem. At first, they were useful. Terrifying, yes, but strategically terrifying. They didn't mind cold weather, didn't need armor, and didn't care if their swords got stuck in someone's ribcage. They were great at killing, terrible at following directions, and occasionally screamed at livestock. But hey, it was the Viking Age. You had to take what you could get. The issue, of course, is what happens after the battle. When everyone else is winding down, collecting spoils, maybe sitting around the fire telling exaggerated stories about how many Saxons they stabbed, your berserker is still foaming. Still biting things. Still very much in the mood. Which was a problem. You can't have elite warriors who don't come with an off switch. Especially if they've just realized they enjoyed trampling people a little too much. The sagas are full of these moments. Berserkers going rogue, causing property damage, issuing challenges at funerals. You know, classic awkward social faux pas. There's a wonderful passage in the Egil saga, one of those sagas where everyone dies eventually and no one learns anything, where a group of berserkers arrive at a feast and immediately start demanding marriage rights. Not introductions. Not polite flirtation. Just bride or brawl. When told no, they threaten to duel everyone in the building. A calm and mature response. And this wasn't a one-time thing. Over time, berserkers developed a reputation not just for violence, but for being socially exhausting. They didn't respect boundaries. They challenged everyone. They insulted kings. One of them probably tried to bite a priest. Eventually, people got tired of pretending that his just passionate was a good excuse for axe-related injuries. So the laws started changing. Let's float now to Iceland, where legal documents from the 11th century start explicitly mentioning Berserkergang, the Berserker Fury, as a crime. Not just frowned upon. Illegal. If someone went berserk, frothing, howling, destroying furniture, the law allowed you to kill them on sight. No trial. No waiting. Just a clear understanding that if you turned into a human bear in the middle of dinner, that was everyone's cue to solve the problem quickly. One law even specifies that berserkers could be exiled for life or outlawed entirely, which is Viking for don't come back unless you want to be stabbed again. There's also the matter of Christianity creeping in. As Scandinavia converted, one awkward handshake at a time, berserkers started to look inconvenient. They were too pagan, too wild, too obviously not into the whole turn the other cheek thing. The church wasn't thrilled with public screaming, ritual rage, and warriors who claimed Odin made them do it. By the 12th century, berserkers had gone from feared warriors to embarrassing relics. They started showing up in stories as antagonists, not heroes. Thugs. Disruptors. Men who couldn't control themselves. The kind of people polite society made laws about, not for. You see it in the sagas. Earlier stories treat berserkers with awe. Later ones, not so much. By the time King Magnus the Good comes around, 11th century Norway, is outlawing berserkers entirely, declaring them enemies of the realm. And when a Viking king says you're too violent, you know things have gone sideways. So what happened to them? Some faded into mercenary work. Others just adjusted, put on shirts, stopped biting shields, rebranded as very enthusiastic warriors with dramatic instincts. A few probably became bodyguards in foreign courts, where no one asked too many questions about their past. One or two might have opened a tavern and never spoke of it again. And then, slowly, they passed into myth. The actual, functional berserkers vanished. But their image, half man, half beast, all frothing chaos, lingered. They became metaphors, warnings, the kind of thing you told children when they got too loud in public. Don't go berserk, or the king's men will throw you in a fjord. But even in their decline, there was a strange respect, a sense that the berserkers had touched something older, wilder, a power that was both admired and feared. Let's float now to that power itself, because beneath all the roaring and biting, there's a deeper idea here, a mythic concept, the line between man and animal, civilization and chaos. The idea that someone could choose to become something else. Not just pretend, but transform. Not through magic. Through rage. Through sheer, feral will. It's not subtle. It's not safe. But it's powerful. And it still echoes. In literature. In pop culture. In the way we describe someone going berserk when they lose control. The berserker might be gone, but the metaphor refuses to die. For now, the longhouse is quiet. The last bear cloak is folded. And someone, somewhere, is still telling the story of that one guy who bit through his shield, fought 12 men, and then demanded seconds at the feast. Because of course he did. So, we've covered the berserkers, shirtless, foaming, angry at chairs. But they weren't the only shape-shifting enthusiasts in the Norse world. If you've ever wondered, wait, were there also Viking werewolves? The answer is, yes. Of course there were. Because apparently, medieval Scandinavia looked at the berserker and thought, what if we doubled down and gave him fur? Enter the Ulfhina, which, yes, is even harder to pronounce than it looks. Old Norse for something like wolf coat or wolf hide, depending on who you ask and how long they've been translating sagas. The Ulfhina were, essentially, the wolf-flavored cousins of the berserkers. Just as angry. Just as unpredictable. Slightly more fashion-forward, if you were into pelts. They were said to wear wolf skins into battle, possibly as armor, more likely as intimidation. But it wasn't just a fashion statement. Like the berserkers, they were believed to become the animal. Not metaphorically. Not emotionally. Literally. As in, I am now a wolf and will behave accordingly. Please give me space and don't look me in the eye. And it didn't stop at behavior. The sagas describe these warriors as snarling, biting, howling, sometimes moving on all fours, which is either extremely threatening or extremely awkward, depending on the terrain. They're described as immune to weapons, as being in a trance, as being somewhere between man and beast. So, what's going on here? Is this just berserkers in different outfits? A new marketing team? Possibly. But the wolf imagery runs deeper. The Norse had a long-standing fascination with wolves, both feared and revered. Odin himself was accompanied by two wolves, Jerry and Freki. The giant wolf Fenrir was prophesied to eat the sun. And random wolves show up in Norse poetry with all the subtlety of a metal album cover. There's something deeply rooted in the culture here. This idea of stepping outside your human identity and taking on something wild. Unpredictable. Dangerous. The Ulfhina weren't just warriors. They were ritual specialists. Possibly cultic. Some historians believe they were part of a closed warrior order, sort of like a furry, pre-Christian fight club, with spiritual training, initiation rites, and probably a fair amount of aggressive growling. And again, this wasn't viewed as embarrassing. If anything, it was prestigious. It meant you were closer to the gods. You weren't just a fighter, you were chosen. Part of something older. Wilder. Let's float now to the bigger idea behind all this, shape-shifting. Because for the Norse, becoming an animal wasn't strange. It was spiritual. Deep. sometimes disturbing. They had an entire vocabulary for it. Hama was your physical shape. Hamingja was your luck spirit. Filgja was your shadow self that followed you around, sometimes in animal form, like a very judgmental emotional support wolf. Changing your form was called Hamrama, literally, strong in shape. It meant someone who could shift their appearance, their essence, not necessarily into a literal animal, but into a different state of being, often in battle, occasionally at night, always a little unsettling. It's why the line between Berserker and Ulfheim gets blurry. Both were about becoming something else, stepping into a new skin, letting go of control. Whether through trance, rage, ritual, or mushrooms, that part's still up for debate. They entered a space where they were no longer quite human, and everyone else got out of the way. Of course, over time, the tone shifted. As Christianity spread, these shape-shifting warriors went from honored to problematic. Turning into a wolf was suddenly not cool, religiously speaking. Demonic, even. Stories changed. What was once respected became a warning. The Ulfhena were rebranded as werewolves, cursed, hunted, tragic. There's an eerie little saga, Volsunga, where a father and son discover wolf pelts in the woods. Magic ones. When they put them on, they become wolves, can't take them off for 10 days. They roam the forest, attack travelers, and eventually, one of them gets stabbed. Not fatally, just enough to ruin the mood. It's a classic tale. Moral unclear. Possibly don't put on strange fur you find in the woods. Or bonding with your dad is hard when you're both turning into apex predators. And yet, the idea never really died. Even as Berserkers and Ulfhena faded into history, the stories remained. And not just in Scandinavia. The image of the uncontrollable warrior, the man who becomes beast, shows up everywhere. In folklore, in medieval demonology, in every video game that has a rage mechanic and a howling animation. Because the myth taps into something deeper. The fear that we can lose ourselves. That beneath the armor, the cloak, the name, there's something else. Waiting. Watching. Growling softly, just under the surface. Let's float now to how these ideas twisted into entertainment. The Berserker as a joke. A trope. A punchline. Because eventually, history turned them into cartoons. But that's for the next part. For now, the wolves are silent. The pelts are hung up. And the last howl fades quietly into the frozen air. So, what do you do with a rage-fueled Viking warrior once he's no longer fashionable? Apparently, you put him in a video game. The Berserker has had a truly weird afterlife. He went from sacred warrior to outlawed menace, then from feared social problem to misunderstood literary footnote. And now, here's a character class. A button mash. A Halloween costume if you own enough fake fur and your neighbors don't ask too many questions. But let's go back a step. Even before pop culture got its hands on him, the Berserker had already gone soft in the public imagination. As early as the 13th century, you start seeing a shift. The sagas, those long, wandering, morally confused Icelandic epics, start treating Berserkers less like divine warriors and more like punchlines. They show up late. They make a mess. They fight people at weddings. One shows up, demands a duel, and then gets quietly murdered in the night by someone who just wanted to finish their ale in peace. The tone is unmistakable. Berserkers. Again. They become a stock character. The loose cannon. The guy who ruins the party. Less Fenrir the Wolf and more that guy from high school who still headbutts bar stools and insists it's just his thing. And then, centuries later, as Vikings became romanticized, first in literature, then in Hollywood, the Berserker came back. But shinier, cleaner, less historically accurate and more action figure. Suddenly, they're everywhere. In comics, in games, in fantasy novels. Always shirtless, always snarling, usually wielding 2 axes for no reason. Sometimes magic, sometimes cursed, always a little misunderstood. And let's be honest, they're fun. The Berserker is the ultimate power fantasy. Unstoppable, uncontrollable, Someone who charges into battle without thinking, without doubting, without worrying about taxes. They don't strategize. They don't monologue. They just go. Which is appealing. In small doses. On screen. But what gets lost is the weirdness. The mythic strangeness. The cultural weight of someone who chose to step outside of human norms. Not for glory. Not for loot. But for transformation. To become something else. Something sacred and dangerous and in between. Today, berserk just means angry. Loud. Frenzied. It's used for toddlers. Sports fans. People at Black Friday sales. Which is a little sad. Because the original berserker wasn't just rage. He was ritualized. Structured. A product of a society that believed in warriors who could cross into another state of being. Briefly, violently, and at great cost. He wasn't just angry. He was other. Let's float now to the symbolism that still lingers. Berserkers have become mascots for everything from metal bands to military units. There's a unit of the Swedish army with a berserker logo. A Norwegian biker gang named after them. At least 6 college football teams in North America using Viking berserker imagery, despite none of them being located anywhere near Scandinavia or having access to fjords. And then there are the games. The fantasy franchises. The ones that let you enter rage mode. Everything goes red. Your stats triple. You scream a lot. Damage output goes up. Defense goes down. You are, briefly, unstoppable. And probably shirtless. It's fun. But it's also hollow. The real berserker wasn't a power-up. He wasn't a side quest. He was a person. With a name. A home. Possibly a goat. And a job that involved channeling something primal and terrifying. Because his society needed it. Or thought it did. And when society stopped needing it, he disappeared. Or rather, he was erased. Slowly. Gently. Not with violence. But with ridicule. Outlawed in law codes. Mocked in sagas. Softened in memory. Until all that was left was a caricature. A stereotype. A class bonus in your character sheet. And yet, somewhere in the back of our collective imagination, the idea still lingers. Not of a man biting a shield, but of a person transforming. Stepping into something deeper. Uncontrollable. Briefly divine. And deeply inconvenient at dinner parties. So tonight, as the story winds down, picture the last berserker, not charging into battle, but standing alone, unsure of what to do next. The war is over. The king has laws now. No one wants a screaming shirtless man in a bear pelt knocking over furniture. The rage doesn't have a place anymore. So he folds his pelt. He sits. He waits. And maybe, just maybe, he listens to the fire crackle. Because for the first time in his life, no one is watching. And he can finally, quietly, be still. Video outro, drift off, history style. And that brings us to the end. 4 stories. A few royal disasters. Some unfortunate inbreeding. A touch of ceremonial stomping. And one very angry Viking who just wanted to scream at a pine tree. If you've made it this far, congrats. You've survived the parade of dysfunctional monarchs, sacred elephants, genetically doomed marriages, and whatever that mushroom guy from earlier was doing. Hopefully, you're now fully horizontal, blanket tucked, brain melting slightly under the weight of obscure historical trivia. Because really, that's the point. History isn't just about battles or borders. It's about people. Weird people. Lonely people. People with crowns and questionable cousins. People who thought training an elephant to execute prisoners was a good use of state funds. And all of them lived, screamed, collapsed, and expired in a world that, thankfully, you do not have to wake up in tomorrow. So as we let these stories fade into the dark, just remember, someone once bit through a shield for no reason. Someone else wore solid gold on their toes while starving peasants farmed nearby. And someone, definitely someone, died because a royal elephant felt like it. Sleep well knowing you're not in any of those sagas. Thanks for staying up with me. You can close your eyes now, and I'll see you in the next strange, slightly disappointing chapter of history. Good night.